So 19 new properties to investigate. Most thought that they had rising damp, but in fact, the cause was much more benign, much more commonplace and easy to solve. I'm Simon from Damp Surveys. If you want more videos like this, please like, subscribe and comment. We read every comment and love to know how much money we've saved you by avoiding unnecessary damp proofing treatment. We're going to start with hygroscopic salts. We're going to look at ingress from rainwater, including into the subfloor void. We're going to have a look at excess vapour and rot. Rot will come from many different issues. There's a lot of overlap, but I'm going to focus on the primary cause in each property. We're then going to have a section looking at the excess vapour, because almost all the properties had excess vapour. So starting with hygroscopic salts. Hygroscopic salts are these salts that come from chimney breasts, primarily from the burning of fossil fuels such as coal. They also come from horse urine. They can also come from rising damp, but that's the least common cause of them. And it doesn't mean that there's an ongoing risk of rising damp. Rising damp comes from groundwater, that's the water under the water table. In both these properties, the hygroscopic salts were on the first floor, so it couldn't possibly have been from rising damp. But in a majority of cases, they wouldn't come from rising damp anyway. Let's have a look at those properties now. So the first hygroscopic salts problem was in an arts and crafts house. We can see these damp patches on a chimney breast. They don't disappear in the summertime. There were spots of grease marks that looked very similar to damp patches downstairs. There was also mold, which is unusual to find in the same environment as hygroscopic salts, but it was in a completely separate area. There was a vapour issue as well as hygroscopic salts. Now, the second property had hygroscopic salts again on the first floor around a chimney breast. Hygroscopic salts typically come from the burning of coal. When they're released, they go into the brick and remain there until and unless it's dampened, such as when the plaster is replaced, including when it's damp proofed. So hygroscopic salts are quite easy to spot. They're the damp patches that you see in winter and summertime. Hygroscopic salts cause deliquescence, which is a type of condensation. So they can be mixed up with condensation, but in summertime, those patches are caused by hygroscopic salts. Very unlikely to be caused by condensation. You're unlikely to see surface salts, although you can. You're unlikely to see a stain, although you can. You can test them by taking a sample and putting it into a sealed container and measuring the relative humidity at different temperatures. Calcium nitrate, the most common one, has a relative humidity around 50%. Ingress or rainwater penetrating damp is where rainwater either goes into the subfloor void and causes rising damp like symptoms where it condenses above the damp proof course, or it's from guttering, drainage from the roof, or from render, poor render, cracked render. So we're going to have a look at all those different issues now. First property affected by rainwater is a Victorian ground floor, lower ground floor maisonette. There is a brown patch which indicates water passing through building material. It has been damp proofed in the past, but the area was below ground anyway. So this is penetrating damp. It's rainwater coming through cracks in the render and along the base of the wall. Next property, it had been damp proofed as well. There's dampness on the internal wall. The damp proofing is obviously, or was in this case, external wall, but damp proofing doesn't deal with the root cause. The root cause was water in the subfloor void that came from a broken gully to the front of the property. Vapour condenses above the damp-proof course. It risks rot, and in this case, fortunately, the rot was cellar rot and wood weevil as opposed to dry rot, but it could have easily been dry rot. It's more common for damp-proofing treatment to cause rot than for there to have been rising damp in the first place. This property is a mid-wall property that has been vacant for a while. The gutter was dripping and this is causing penetrating damp. There's brown staining and some mold. Next property, there's brown staining on an external wall and slightly on the internal wall. On the party wall, the gutters on the outside were partially blocked There's also one set of walls was painted and the other set weren't painted, and you can get this effect where it doesn't evaporate out of the painted side as easily, and so it retains water in the wall. There was also excessive vapour. Next property, it had been damp, it was drying out, and by the time of this survey, this wall was dry enough to repaint. There had been a gully leak and overflowing water. There was dampness elsewhere, and that was caused by excess vapour. Rot comes from a number of sources of water, but it wouldn't come from rising damp. It would come from water running into the subfloor, so that's rainwater primarily, or a leak, or it can come from condensation. So this is a recently purchased mid-terrace Victorian house. There was rot to the front. It was a brown rot called cellar rot. There was some wood weevil there. The piece of timber was actually dry at the time of the survey. There must have been a leak at some point in the past. There was evidence that timber had been replaced from the subfloor void. Difficult to know, but it isn't an ongoing problem. The buyers were told that the property had rising damp despite there already having been damp proofing treatment. So an example of dry rot. This was interesting in that there was dampness in the wall coming from the base of the wall. It was a brown colour, brown stain, and it turns out that it had been damp proofed and that the brown stain was being forced through the wall by the dry rot, the respiration from the dry rot. We found it underneath the timber in the corner, took it out. It's true to say that there's more dampness caused by the respiration from dry rot than from rising damp. The next property was a tenanted property. When it was owner occupied, they had it damp proofed. There was dampness at the base of the wall, but it was coming from the subfloor. We found rot in the subfloor. There was cellar rot with wood weevil, plus some white rot. It appeared that condensation was forming behind the cistern and dripping down to the area just on the inside of this bedroom. So the next property is a Victorian extension, had cellar rot and wood weevil, and it was caused by lack of subfloor ventilation, water trapped in the subfloor, covered by a laminate flooring. Excess vapour is defined as whenever the internal dew point goes above the outside temperature. I'm going to focus on excess vapour in a separate video. About 50% of the properties had defective extractor fans, including modern properties with modern whole house ventilation systems. The big takeaway is damp proofing can cause more problems than it solves.